Hello, my dear wanderers. It's Soren. Welcome back. Tonight, we journey to a time before microscopes, before vaccines, when the world was ruled not just by kings and empires, but by something unseen. Imagine the hush of desert air over the Valley of the Kings, sand shifting like whispers around a tomb, sealed for millennia. Inside, a pharaoh's face keeps a quiet secret. Tiny scars that speak of an ancient illness across centuries and continents. That same invisible presence moves through markets, temples, and palaces, shaping the fate of nations as softly as wind over stone. So, before you drift into sleep, take a moment to like and subscribe. Only if this brought you calm. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's drift into tonight's journey together. The story of smallpox begins not with a scientist, but with a corpse, deep beneath the sands of Egypt. In the Valley of the Kings rests the mummified body of Pharaoh Ramses V. He ruled briefly more than 3,000 years ago, and today he is remembered less for his reign than for his skin. Even in death, his face bears the small oval scars of a disease that would outlive his empire. Those ancient marks are the oldest physical evidence of smallpox, the same illness that would one day redraw the maps of continents. The ancient Egyptians had gods for nearly everything: sunlight, floods, rebirth, but none powerful enough to protect a king from a virus. The lesions scattered across Ramses' cheeks and shoulders told a simple truth: smallpox made no distinctions. Royal or commoner, soldier or farmer, anyone with skin could host it. The disease was democratic long before democracy existed. It required only one condition to thrive: a crowd. Smallpox did not belong to hunter-gatherers who roamed sparsely across grasslands. It belonged to builders, to those who settled near rivers, grew crops, stored grain, and created the first true cities in the packed quarters of early civilizations along the Nile. The Tigris and the Indus, the virus found its paradise. Every newborn was another potential home. Every market another experiment in transmission. Archaeologists studying ancient India have found Sanskrit writings that describe a fever causing pustules and scarring, attributed to the wrath of a goddess named Shitala. She rode a donkey and carried both a pot of cool water and a broom to cleanse and to soothe. In China, a 4th century physician named Jia Hong observed that survivors never caught the illness twice, an insight quietly waiting for a future scientist to turn it into salvation. But at the time there was no salvation, only endurance. For centuries, smallpox remained a local terror. Egypt had its outbreaks, India its rituals of appeasement, China its resigned wisdom. The disease was woven into daily life like famine or flood, dreaded but ordinary. Then humanity built empires, and the virus was invited to travel. By the 2nd century CE, the Roman Empire covered most of the known Western world, 50 million people connected by roads, ports, and bureaucracy. It was a marvel of engineering, a vast web designed for commerce and conquest. Unfortunately, it was also ideal for infection. When Roman troops returned from campaigns in the east around 1605 CE, they brought with them not only loot but a new passenger, smallpox, most likely picked up in Mesopotamia. What followed was the Antonine plague, named after the dynasty of emperors who presided over it. Contemporary accounts describe fevers, rashes, and death on a scale no physician had seen. At its peak, 2,000 people died each day in Rome. The empire's population may have dropped by a tenth. Fields went untended, legions thinned, and the state's tax base withered. Marcus Aurelius himself watched the disaster unfold, writing stoic meditations while the empire trembled. His co-emperor Lucius Verus died of the plague. Marcus followed soon after, exhausted and alone. Smallpox did not destroy Rome, but it weakened the bones of the giant. Economies shrank, armies recruited slaves and foreigners, and faith in the old gods faltered. In their place rose new religions that promised comfort, community, and meaning in suffering. Christianity spread partly on that quiet wind of despair. The virus, indifferent to theology, simply moved on. When Rome finally fractured centuries later, smallpox continued along the trade routes that replaced the legions. Camel caravans crossed Central Asia, ships hugged coastlines, merchants swapped silks and spices, and microscopic passengers. The Silk Road was less a highway than a series of handshakes, each one an opportunity for exchange, human and viral alike. In the Islamic world, physicians such as Al-Razi catalogued smallpox with scientific clarity, distinguishing it from measles and noting that recovery brought lifelong protection. In Japan, the disease arrived in 735 CE and killed perhaps a third of the population, including the powerful Fujiwara brothers who dominated the imperial court. The emperor built the great Buddha of Nara, partly as a gesture of grief. The statue still sits there, serene and heavy, a bronze memory of panic. Europe's encounter was slower, less spectacular, and more constant. By the Middle Ages, smallpox had become a fixture, an uninvited guest at every cradle. Most people caught it as children. Many died. Survivors carried its autograph on their faces. Beauty standards adapt. Artists painted smooth skin as an ideal, precisely because so few possessed it. To be unscarred was to seem blessed. When armies marched to the Crusades, they carried faith in one direction and disease in both. Pilgrims to Rome or Santiago left more than footprints along the roads. By 1500, smallpox had become so ordinary in Europe that people hardly noticed its global potential. That would change the moment sails caught the Atlantic wind. The first recorded outbreak in the Americas occurred in 1518, when an infected slave ship reached Hispaniola. From there, smallpox hopped from island to island, then to the mainland. Within 2 years, it reached the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, a city larger than any in Europe. The epidemic preceded the Spanish siege, weakening the defenders before the first cannon fired. Chroniclers described bodies piled in streets, priests unable to perform rites, whole neighborhoods silent except for coughing. The New World had no immunity, biological, cultural, among the Inca. The disease arrived even before the conquistadors did, killing the emperor Huayna Capac and throwing his empire into civil war. When Francisco Pizarro finally arrived, he found a society already fractured and grieving. A few hundred Spaniards with muskets and horses finished what the virus had begun. None of it was deliberate. No early form of germ warfare, just a catastrophic asymmetry of exposure. Europeans had coexisted with smallpox for centuries, their survivors hardened by immunity. The indigenous peoples of the Americas met it like lightning. Historians estimate that smallpox and its microbial allies reduced native populations by as much as 90% within a century. The Americas were conquered as much by biology as by steel. In Europe, the disease continued its old routine. Monarchs died in their beds from the same infection that killed peasants in theirs. Between the 16th and 18th centuries, smallpox ended the lives of rulers from Russia, France, and England, sometimes changing the course of dynasties. Courts mourned, theologians speculated, and nothing changed. Each generation accepted smallpox as the price of being human. Still, the world was learning. In the Ottoman Empire, women practiced a risky ritual known as variolation, deliberately introducing material from mild smallpox cases into the skin of healthy people. Most recovered with immunity. A few died. In 1718, the English aristocrat Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, scarred by her own bout, witnessed the practice in Constantinople and brought it home to Britain. She had her son inoculated and survived the social outrage that followed. Within decades, the idea spread across Europe and the American colonies. It was still dangerous, but less so than the disease itself. Then, at the close of the 18th century, came Edward Jenner, a country doctor with more curiosity than pedigree. He noticed that milkmaids who caught a mild disease called cowpox never suffered smallpox afterward. In 1796, he tested the idea by inoculating an 8-year-old boy with material from a cowpox lesion, then later exposing him to smallpox. The boy remained healthy. Jenner called the method vaccination from vacca, Latin for cow, and changed history with a single syllable. It was safer, simpler, and astonishingly effective. Within a generation, vaccination became common practice in Europe and its colonies. The same networks that had once spread smallpox now carried its antidote. For once, global trade worked in humanity's favor. But smallpox was not finished yet. It would take another century and a half, and the combined effort of nearly every nation on Earth, to end the story that began in Ramses' vast tomb. The next chapters unfold not in temples or palaces, but in field stations, laboratories, and quiet arguments about what it means to eliminate an enemy that once defined existence itself. As the 19th century opened, smallpox still lingered like smoke after a fire. It drifted through cities, hiding in crowded tenements, hitching rides on trains and ships, always searching for new lungs to invade. Even as vaccination spread, the virus found gaps, villages too remote, parents too skeptical, governments too slow. Its decline was steady, but never smooth. In industrial England, smallpox became both a medical and political argument. Mandatory vaccination laws were passed in the 1850s, meant to protect children and, by extension, the workforce. The laws succeeded medically, but failed socially. Crowds protested what they saw as an intrusion on parental rights and bodily autonomy. In Leicester, demonstrators paraded an effigy of a doctor through the streets before burning it in symbolic defiance. Health officials called the protest ignorant. The protesters called the officials tyrants. Neither side was entirely wrong. The relationship between science and trust was fragile, as it would always be. Still, the numbers improved. Each new decade saw fewer graves dug for smallpox. Vaccination had turned the disease from a grim certainty into a manageable threat. Even so, the virus refused to vanish. It haunted colonial ports, army barracks, and rural hospitals, thriving wherever bureaucracy stumbled. It had become, in effect, a mirror of global inequality. The 19th century loved progress, and smallpox became one of its favorite cautionary tales. Illustrations in newspapers contrasted the clean order of modern vaccination with the chaos of older time. Posters showed happy children with smooth cheeks, mothers smiling beside them, the caption implying that science had civilized not only bodies but morals. The tone was optimistic, sometimes smug. Humanity was, it seemed, on its way to tidying up nature itself. Then, the world caught fire again. In the early 20th century, as nations armed for modern war, Smallpox reappeared in the trenches and refugee camps of Europe and Asia. Vaccination programs faltered under the strain of global conflict. Soldiers moving between continents carried microbes as efficiently as bullets. Even in victory, the victors brought infection home. After World War II, the newly formed World Health Organization inherited the mess. In some regions, smallpox was still endemic. In others, it smoldered quietly, waiting for a lapse. By the 1950s, the disease killed roughly 2 million people each year. Those numbers had become abstractions, too large for mourning, too steady for alarm. It was simply background noise to modern life. Then, in 1958, a proposal reached the WHO assembly from an unlikely source: the Soviet Union. The delegate suggested a global campaign to eradicate smallpox entirely. The timing was strange. The Cold War was deepening. The world seemed to prefer division to unity. Yet, the idea appealed to everyone's sense of reason. Smallpox was a universal enemy, politically neutral, deadly to all. A motion passed to explore the possibility. The budget, however, was meager, barely enough to supply vaccines to a handful of countries. Progress crept along like an underfed mule. During the 1960s, field reports told a frustrating story. In South Asia, vaccination drives reached millions, yet outbreaks continued. In Africa, nomadic populations carried the virus across borders faster than governments could respond. The campaign needed more than good intentions. It needed organization. Enter Donald A. Henderson, an American epidemiologist with a talent for logistics and a taste for blunt honesty. In 1966, he was appointed to lead the WO's intensified eradication program. He quickly realized that success depended not on vaccinating everyone, but on vaccinating the right people at the right time. The idea of surveillance and containment replaced the older model of mass vaccination. It was both elegant and practical. Find every outbreak, isolate the cases, and create a ring of immunity around them. The method required vigilance, patience, and paperwork. Field workers traveled by jeep, by foot, by any means available, carrying vaccines that had to stay cold in hot climates. They followed rumors, fevers in one village, strange rashes in another, and traced every contact. The virus was cornered, not by brute force, but by persistence. The results were astonishing. In West Africa, cases fell from tens of thousands to a few hundred within years. In India, where dense populations and summer heat seemed unbeatable obstacles, the tide finally turned. By the mid-1970s, only a handful of countries reported active smallpox. For the first time in recorded history, an ancient plague was retreating faster than it advanced. But victory demanded precision, and precision demanded faith in data. Henderson's team built a global network of reports, forms, and verifications, a kind of proto-internet made of paper and radio. Each suspected case was documented, photographed, and mapped. Teams debated whether a rash qualified as smallpox or chickenpox, whether a rumor counted as a lead. Bureaucracy became a weapon. Even so, setbacks arrived regularly. In Ethiopia, war complicated fieldwork. In Bangladesh, floods destroyed vaccine supplies. In India, one stubborn outbreak lingered for months, sustained by families who hid sick relatives out of fear or pride. Eradication required not only syringes, but persuasion. Doctors became diplomats, priests, and detectives. They learned local languages, bribed officials, promised gifts, and occasionally slept on dirt floors beside the infected. One by one, the last endemic countries fell off the list. By 1975, the virus survived only in parts of the Horn of Africa. The final stronghold was Somalia, a land already weary from conflict and drought. Field workers there operated under armed escort, chasing rumors through desert villages. It was not heroism in the cinematic sense, just endless dust, heat, and paperwork. In October 1977, a hospital cook named Ali Malmadan developed a fever and a familiar rash. He lived in the coastal town of Mecca, Somalia. His infection was confirmed as smallpox, the last naturally occurring case in human history. He survived. The disease did not. After 2 years of surveillance confirming no new cases, the World Health Organization made its declaration. Smallpox was gone. Humanity had done something previously reserved for myth. It had slain a monster completely. For the scientist involved, the announcement felt both immense and anticlimactic. The world did not erupt in parades. Most people had already forgotten the fear. Yet for those who had chased the virus across continents, it was the end of an era defined by urgency and exhaustion. They had outlasted history itself. What followed would be quieter, but no less complex. A global debate about what to do with the last remnants of the enemy, the frozen vials of variola virus, stored in 2 laboratories on opposite sides of a divided world. The war was over, but the question of what to do with the weapon remained. When the world announced that smallpox was gone, there was relief, but also uncertainty. The disease that had shaped so much of human behavior had ended not with a dramatic cure, but with paperwork, logistics, and exhaustion. Yet, even as the last patients healed, one question remained unsolved. What should humanity do with the virus itself? Samples of variola, the smallpox virus, still sat frozen in high-security laboratories. The World Health Organization designated just 2 sites authorized to keep them: the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta and the State Research Center of Virology and Biotechnology, known as Vector, in the Soviet Union. Each was expected to preserve a reference stock, a kind of biological relic, in case research or emergencies ever require it. At first, it seemed a simple arrangement. The samples would be studied, catalogued, and eventually destroyed. But destruction deadlines came and went. Science, politics, and human caution conspired to keep the freezers running. For every voice calling for final eradication, another insisted on preservation. The arguments split along familiar lines. Those in favor of destruction framed it as the last step of a moral victory. If the virus existed nowhere outside a steel door, why keep it at all? Why preserve something that had killed hundreds of millions? Every day it remained alive, even frozen, carried a risk. Small, but real. Accidents happen. Governments fall. Power flickers. What if the freezers fail? The preservationists answered that science rarely benefits from burning bridges. The virus, they argued, might teach us new lessons about immunity, about viral evolution, about related diseases that still existed in animals. Destroying it could mean losing information that might one day save lives. Besides, they said, if any unauthorized collections existed elsewhere, undeclared, forgotten, or hidden, then destroying the known ones would only give the illusion of safety. The debate became a kind of global ritual. Every few years, committees met to discuss destruction. Reports were written. New research proposals emerged. Deadlines slipped. By the early 1990s, the Cold War had ended, but the virus endured in its twin fortresses of steel and nitrogen. Security protocols were elaborate, bordering on theatrical. The samples sat in thick-walled freezers, guarded by cameras and biometric locks. Inside, the air was kept so cold that a single breath would crystallize. Scientists who worked there wore sealed suits and moved slowly, aware that a torn glove or broken vial could mean catastrophe. They were not merely researchers, but custodians of something both precious and terrible. Outside those facilities, the rest of the world adjusted to life without smallpox. Children stopped receiving the vaccine. In most countries, routine vaccination ended by the early 1980s. The circular scar that once marked almost every arm became a generational marker, fading slowly from sight. The youngest scientist studying variola had never seen a real case. The disease had become theoretical, existing only in textbooks and freezers. Yet the idea of complete destruction never gained unanimous support. Each time the issue came before the World Health Assembly, compromise prevailed. Destroying the virus seemed final, almost ceremonial, a burial for something that could still theoretically be useful. The laboratories became like cathedrals of containment, places where the faithful kept their relics in temperature-controlled devotion. From time to time, the world received small reminders of its vulnerability. In 1978, even before official eradication, a laboratory accident in Birmingham, England, released a smallpox strain into the air of a medical building. 2 people became infected. One of them died. The incident proved how easily containment could fail. It also fueled both sides of the argument. To some, it showed the danger of keeping the virus. To others, it demonstrated the need for continued study and preparation. Decades later, in 2014, scientists cleaning an old storage room at the US National Institutes of Health discovered 6 forgotten vials labeled variola. They had sat unnoticed for nearly 60 years. The discovery was almost comically mundane, another example of humanity's tendency to misplace even the most dangerous things. The vials were quickly destroyed under supervision, but the episode revived the old unease. If forgotten samples could turn up in one freezer, could there be others in some basement laboratory, unknown and unguarded? These incidents changed little about the official stance. The samples remained sealed and stable, while committees debated their fate in circles. Perhaps, after so many years, the argument itself had become a way of keeping the memory alive. Destroying the virus might also destroy the tension, the shared awareness that humanity once faced an enemy, and for now, kept it caged. Meanwhile, new threats arrived. HIV, Ebola, SARS, influenza, all reminded the world that victory over one disease does not mean victory over all. Some scientists privately admitted that the drama over smallpox seemed almost nostalgic, a relic of a time when the enemy was visible, predictable, and curable through human persistence. Compared to the shifting complexity of modern pathogens, smallpox felt like an old villain, terrible, yes, but understandable. In the decades since eradication, research on variola has continued in small, carefully monitored doses. Genetic sequencing revealed the virus's structure in exquisite detail, allowing scientists to simulate it digitally. That knowledge sparked new questions. If its entire genome exists as data, then does destroying the physical samples truly eliminate it? A computer file can be copied indefinitely. The virus, once biological, had quietly become informational. Humanity's triumph over nature had created a new paradox, one that storage drives could replicate forever. Even so, the emotional argument remains strongest. The thought of the virus alive anywhere, even frozen, unsettles the human imagination. The same species that built pyramids and cathedrals also built freezers for its fears. Each hum of the refrigeration system is a reminder that eradication is never absolute. It requires maintenance, electricity, and discipline. One unguarded moment, one power failure, one careless decision, and the ancient fire could flicker again. And yet, for all its potential menace, there is something faintly poetic about those sleeping samples. They are history's fossils, preserved in cold metal rather than stone. Scientists peering into the microscopes see not just viral particles, but the reflection of human persistence, the long, stumbling effort to understand and outlast a force that once defined mortality itself. The frozen debate continues not because humanity is indecisive, but because it cannot quite believe its own success. The laboratories still stand, one in Georgia, one in Siberia, opposite poles of a planet that once trembled under the same fever. Between them hums a fragile truce, an agreement to guard the ghost of a monster long gone, waiting for a future that may finally decide whether to keep it or to let it melt into memory. After the freezers were locked and the papers signed, silence returned, an unfamiliar silence for a world that had lived with smallpox for thousands of years. No more isolation wards, no more hurried burials, no more nervous mothers checking their children's skin in the morning light. The virus had been written out of daily life, leaving only a faint indentation in human habit, like the ghost of handwriting on a scraped clean page. For a while, people did not know what to do with the absence. Scientists who had spent their careers hunting the disease found themselves suddenly unemployed. Epidemiologists who had chased cases across deserts and jungles now sat in fluorescent offices writing reports about what they had already done. They had won a war and were left with peace, and peace felt oddly like boredom. Some returned to other fields, malaria, tuberculosis, polio, but none carried quite the same sense of finality. Smallpox had given them a clear enemy, and the world rarely provides such clarity twice. The victory also changed how humanity imagined itself. For the first time, the species had proven that collective action could erase a natural threat entirely. It was intoxicating. The word eradication became fashionable. Polio was next on the list, then malaria, then measles. Each campaign borrowed tactics from the smallpox program, maps, surveillance, ring vaccination, but each discovered that the conditions that made smallpox conquerable were rare: no animal hosts, an obvious rash, a reliable vaccine. It had been a perfect storm of vulnerability. The other diseases were more elusive, more cunning. Progress came, but slowly, unevenly, never quite complete. Still, smallpox remained the reference point, the example every grant proposal invoked. It was the proof that impossible goals could occasionally be reached. In medical conferences, the phrase "after smallpox" acquired a tone of reverence, as if time itself had split into two eras. Before and after control was demonstrated. Outside laboratories, the victory reshaped ordinary lives in subtler ways. Vaccination scars faded from public view. Children born in the 1980s and beyond grew up unmarked, their skin smooth where their parents bore small round reminders of past danger. For a while, the lack of scars confused school children. Some thought the marks were birth defects. Others believed they were proof of military service. The meaning slipped quietly into obscurity. Artists and writers who sought symbols of fragility sometimes looked back to smallpox for imagery. The pitted faces in old portraits, the whispers of contagion, the isolation wards that had once defined public fear. But as decades passed, even those references felt distant. The disease had become historical, like the bubonic plague or the Great Fire of London, more metaphor than memory. Yet the world's relationship with smallpox never truly ended. It merely changed address. In 1988, the World Health Organization's Committee on Orthopox Viruses gathered in Geneva to discuss the next phase, what to do with the knowledge. The Eradication program had left behind a global network of surveillance, laboratories, and trained workers. Rather than dismantle it, the WHO tended toward other goals: detecting new pathogens, improving vaccine storage, and responding to outbreaks that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. The infrastructure built to defeat one virus became the nervous system of global health. It turned out to be prophetic. Every new epidemic that emerged from Ebola in Africa to SARS in Asia relied on systems designed in the smallpox years: contact tracing, ring containment, rapid response. The skills had outlived the threat. Even today, when scientists trace infection chains on computer dashboards instead of hand-drawn maps, they are repeating the same logic that once pinned red dots across the villages of India and Somalia. But the legacy was not purely practical. There was an emotional residue too, a mix of pride and unease. Pride, because the eradication showed what cooperation could achieve. Unease, because it revealed how fragile that cooperation was. The Cold War had paused long enough for scientists from rival nations to share data, fly across hostile borders, and trust one another with samples and secrets. Such coordination looked almost utopian in hindsight. It had required the threat of a universal enemy to make unity seem rational. After the danger was gone, old divisions returned. Funding shrank. Political interest faded. The Eradication program's veterans joked that their greatest achievement had been to make themselves obsolete. They gave lectures in universities, their slides yellowing with age, while the next generation of students listened politely, vaguely aware that they were hearing the mythology of modern public health. Even the memory of fear began to erode. In the 1990s and early 2000s, as vaccination programs waned, younger doctors encountered patients who had never heard of smallpox except as a trivia question. When asked about the risks of the vaccine, they shrugged. The concept of a virus killing 1 in 3 people seemed implausible. The scar on an older arm looked quaint, almost decorative. Then, at the turn of the millennium, bioterrorism entered public vocabulary. News reports speculated about smallpox as potential as a weapon, about laboratories that might recreate it from genetic blueprints. Suddenly, the ghost stirred again. Governments dusted off old vaccine stockpiles, issued training manuals, and debated emergency plans. The fear felt different this time, abstract, bureaucratic, but familiar in shape. The virus no longer existed in nature, but its idea remained contagious. The irony was hard to miss. Humanity, having defeated smallpox through unprecedented cooperation, now feared it might reappear through human malice. The laboratories in Atlanta and Novosibirsk became symbols of both triumph and temptation. Each freezer represented not only preservation but potential misuse. Security drills were rehearsed. Doors were checked twice. The hum of refrigeration sounded less like comfort and more like a warning. Through all of this, the actual scientists who had touched smallpox remained remarkably calm. Many of them were aging, retired, or gone. Those who still worked with the virus treated it not as a mythic monster, but as a specimen, a brick-shaped particle with a known sequence and predictable behavior. They understood its power, but they also knew its limitations. It could not survive without human hosts. It had no secret tricks, no cunning intelligence. It was dangerous only through proximity and neglect. That practical perspective, however, rarely survives contact with the imagination. For writers, artists, and philosophers, Smallpox became a metaphor for control, the ultimate proof that humans could master nature, and the quiet reminder that mastery requires vigilance forever. Some saw the eradication as a moral victory. Others saw it as a cautionary tale about arrogance. Perhaps they suggested removing an ancient predator from the ecosystem might alter humanity's relationship with humility itself. Still, life moved on. Birth rates rose, cities expanded, wars resumed, and the world forgot that a century earlier, entire towns could vanish beneath a rash and a fever. Only the archivists remembered, cataloguing yellowed photographs of pockmarked faces, their eyes blank but strangely peaceful. Those images remain among the few that can still hush a room. The skin tells its own story of endurance, of recovery, of cost. Today, the smallest remnants of that story live in cold storage and in the faint traces of immunity embedded in older bodies. Everything else is memory, recorded in reports and recollections, waiting for occasional rediscovery. The silence after smallpox is not empty. It hums softly with everything the world learned while trying to end it. And somewhere, beneath the steady buzz of laboratory freezers and the digital hum of archive data, the ghost of the virus continues to whisper, not as a threat, but as a reminder of what cooperation can do when fear and reason briefly hold hands. Those who want destruction frame their case in moral clarity. The virus has no purpose now. They say it cannot teach anything that its genome has not already revealed. To keep it is to court disaster, to preserve the possibility of resurrection. Accidents happen, machines fail, people err. A single broken vial could restart a nightmare that cost millions of lives to end. Humanity has buried its dead once already. There is no reason to keep the shovels close. Every few years, the question returns like an echo. Should the virus finally be destroyed? Each time, the answer dissolves into polite disagreement. The arguments have been rehearsed for decades. The story drifts now from open fields and fading memories into colder rooms, metallic, fluorescent, and humming with electricity. These are the modern tombs of smallpox. In Atlanta, Novosibirsk, the last known particles of the virus sleep inside freezers colder than the poles, watched by cameras that never blink. Scientists come and go in layers of protective gear, moving with the slow grace of astronauts. They are not fighting an epidemic anymore. They are tending a memory that can still bite. The debate has persisted for so long that it has become part of the virus's afterlife. The enemy lives now in paperwork and policy meetings. Each year, a committee gathers under bright lights to discuss the same sentences with slightly different adjectives. No decision ever feels final. Humanity seems reluctant to perform a symbolic act as absolute as burning the last page of its own epic. The opposing camp speaks in quieter tones, but with equal conviction. They remind us that knowledge rarely comes from comfort. The virus, they argue, is a model for others still lurking in nature. Monkeypox, cowpox, camelpox. To understand them fully, one must understand their ancestor. Destroying variola would erase a part of the record. Science, they warn, does not thrive on deletion. Besides, if any unregistered samples exist, and history suggests that some might, then destroying the official ones would only create a false sense of closure. Inside the laboratories, the freezers keep humming, immune to politics. The temperature remains steady. The red indicator lights blink like slow heartbeats. Most of the time, there is nothing to see. The virus rests in sealed vials, no larger than the last joint of a finger. The powder inside so fine it could fit beneath a fingernail. The threat exists entirely in potential. A forgotten switch, a wrong glove, and history could thaw. In 1978, before the eradication was officially certified, a laboratory accident in Birmingham, England, killed a medical photographer named Janet Parker. The virus escaped through an air duct from a research facility housed above her office. It was a small breach, a moment of carelessness, but it proved that containment is never perfect. Parker's death became the last known fatal case of smallpox. The incident haunted laboratory designers for decades afterward. Every new safety protocol, double-door airlocks, negative pressure rooms, vacuum-sealed suits, carries her ghost in its blueprint. Scientists who work with Variolation describe the experience as oddly anticlimactic. Under the electron microscope, the virus appears as a brick-shaped particle, dull and symmetrical. It has none of the sinister drama its history suggests. To see it is to realize how small the source of vast suffering can be. One researcher once said it looked like a battered suitcase. It is easy to imagine that description whispered through the lab, a little joke to soften the tension. Still, no human structure is immortal. Power grids fail, governments dissolve. In theory, these laboratories are among the safest places on Earth. In practice, they are as vulnerable as any other human institution to time and entropy. The freezers depend on constant electricity, the walls depend on budgets, the alarms depend on attention. Even vigilance must sleep sometimes. Still, the idea of smallpox never entirely vanished. It reappears whenever the world talks about biotourism, genetic engineering, or new pandemics. News anchors invoke it as shorthand for catastrophe. Their voice is steady, but their eyes slightly wider. The irony is that the more we talk about eradicating fear, the more we keep it alive. For the rest of the world, the story has slipped into abstraction. Children born after 1980 have no vaccine scar, no family stories about fevers or quarantines. The disease has migrated from memory to metaphor. School books mention it briefly, usually in the same breath as polio or the bubonic plague. The details blur, the magnitude fades, yet behind the humor lies respect. The people allowed near those freezers are not thrill seekers. They are caretakers of a dangerous relic. They keep it for reasons both practical and symbolic, to study its mechanisms, to guard against its misuse, to remind humanity that victory carries maintenance costs. It is the biological equivalent of a disarmed bomb displayed in a museum, proof of what could happen and what once did. Outside the sealed rooms, the practical descendants of the eradication campaign keep working quietly. The same methods that cornered smallpox, valence contact tracing, ring vaccination, are now standard for controlling everything from Ebola to measles. The tools built to bury one virus became the blueprint for managing the rest. Even the idea of global health owes its coherence to smallpox's long defeat. Before eradication, disease control was national. Afterward, it became planetary. Meanwhile, the virus's cousins remind us that family ties endure. Monkeypox, though milder, continues to appear sporadically in Central and West Africa. When it crossed into other continents centuries later, the headlines carried a familiar echo. New pox outbreak, they said, as if the ghost had found its way out of the freezer. But monkeypox, like a younger sibling desperate for attention, never achieved the same menace. Humanity had learned too much. The protocols were ready. The fear was smaller. Within the WHO, destruction deadlines continue to drift like slow clouds. The most recent resolutions still postpone judgment, always with the promise of further study. No one seems eager to be the generation that declares the final act. Perhaps it is superstition. Perhaps it is wisdom. To destroy smallpox would mean admitting that we are done learning from it. And the world has rarely agreed on when learning is complete. It exists now as a concept that must be maintained. A reminder that even victory requires upkeep. The hum of the freezers is the sound of history still being supervised. Perhaps one day the debate will end. The virus will be destroyed, and the world will commemorate the event with speeches about progress and unity. Or perhaps the freezers will remain, watched by generations of caretakers who never quite trust the silence. In either case, smallpox has achieved a strange immortality, not through infection, but through the very efforts to prevent its return. And so, the freezers stay locked, humming steadily through seasons and political shifts. They are monuments to both caution and curiosity. When the power fails for a few seconds during a storm, generators rumble to life. Maintaining the cold, the red lights blink back on, as though the virus itself had taken a small, contented breath. The marks themselves tell a story of cooperation and patience. The small, round depression formed when the bifurcated needle, a two-pronged metal tool designed to hold a drop of vaccine, scratched the upper arm in a precise pattern. Within a week, a blister formed, then a scab. Once the scab fell off, the body bore its permanent signature. Millions of people shared that same small circle of protection. It was, in a way, the largest unifying brand humanity ever chose willingly. In the quieter decades that followed eradication, smallpox survived mostly in memory and in the faint circular scars that older people carried on their arms. For a long time, those scars were so common they went unnoticed. Then, gradually, they became relics. Children began to ask their grandparents what the small puckered mark was, and the answers often came with long pauses, as if the older generation had to remind themselves that the fear attached to it was no longer necessary. The scar had once been a sign of protection, proof that a person had been vaccinated and therefore safe. In the 19th and 20th centuries, armies checked soldiers' arms for the mark before deployment. Schools required it for enrollment, and travel papers listed it like a passport stamp. To be unscarred was suspicious, even dangerous. Now it is the reverse. A bare arm simply means you were born late enough for luck. Without the disease to justify it, the scar turned ornamental. Some people joked that it looked like a misplaced dimple or an accidental crater. But the emotional residue lingered. For those who remembered the campaigns, that mark represented not just immunity but participation in a global project, a quiet, unheralded act of citizenship. Historians studying photographs from the mid-20th century often note how visible those marks are in crowds. In markets, parades, and factory lines, small dark dots scatter across bare arms, like punctuation. The sight now feels strangely comforting, a reminder of shared vulnerability and shared effort. Few other eras left a physical emblem of collective safety so literally skin deep. Before eradication, of course, smallpox left other marks, larger, crueler, impossible to hide. Survivors carried pockmarks on their faces, arms and hands. Some lost their sight to the scarring that formed on the cornea. In societies where appearance shaped status and marriage prospects, the disease redrew hierarchies overnight. A face once considered beautiful could become a map of healed wounds. People learned to read those marks as biography. This one survived as a child, that one lost siblings, another became immune and indispensable as a caregiver. The disappearance of visible smallpox changed what the world looked like. Literally, artists who had once softened scars in portraits no longer needed to. The smooth skin that painters idealized became at last an attainable reality. Cosmetics shifted focus from covering blemishes to enhancing features, reflecting a new kind of vanity born from health. The aesthetic of the modern world owes something to that absence. Still, history lingers in habits. In some parts of India, families continue to leave offerings for Shitala Mata, the cooling goddess who once presided over smallpox. The rituals softened, but did not vanish. What had been a plea for mercy became a gesture of gratitude, a recognition that something vast and terrible had finally ended. In West Africa, older women told children about the red sickness that came before their time, a story of heat and rash that made the skin burn like the sun. The children listened politely, doubtful that such a thing had ever been real. Yet beneath the surface of beauty and progress lies a quieter transformation. Without smallpox, humanity's relationship with mortality changed. For thousands of years, every generation expected certain losses as part of ordinary life. Childhood death, disfigurement, epidemics that arrived like weather. Eradication removed one of those certainties. It made death less predictable and therefore more shocking. People began to think of health as a right rather than a temporary reprieve. The age of medical optimism had begun. As the virus receded, so did the language that described it. Words like pest house, quarantine yard, and variolator fell out of common use. They linger only in archives and in the occasional curiosity of crossword puzzles. The word vaccine, however, remained and multiplied. What began as a term for cowpox, inoculation, became the foundation for an entire vocabulary of prevention. When people line up today for flu shots or childhood immunizations, they are participating in a linguistic and moral lineage that began with Edward Jenner and a dairymaid's hands. The fading of fear created new ironies. In the late 20th century, as memories of epidemics dimmed, anti-vaccination movements reappeared in wealthier countries, freed from the daily presence of disease. Some people began to doubt the necessity of the very tools that had granted them that freedom. Scientists viewed this skepticism with weary recognition. History, they knew, has a short attention span. Every generation must relearn the cost of complacency. For those who remember, the lessons remain visceral in their recollections. Smallpox was not a single event, but a constant background hum, a fact of life that shaped how people planned, traveled, and prayed. They recall the sound of coughing in the next room, the smell of disinfectant, the way neighbors avoided eye contact when fevers spread. These memories are fading now, archived in interviews and documentary. When the last generation that remembers is gone, smallpox will pass fully into history, and memory will belong to books alone. And so, in the early 21st century, smallpox lives in fragments, in scars on aging arms, in frozen vials under lock and key, in genetic codes and cautious metaphors. Its disappearance from daily life feels both miraculous and fragile. Eradication was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new relationship between humanity and its microbes, one defined less by surrender and more by negotiation. Even as memory dims, the ghost of the disease persists in modern science. Geneticists continue to study how smallpox shaped human evolution. Certain immune system genes appear to bear the signature of ancient selection proof that survival once depended on who could mount the right defense against variola. In this sense, the virus never truly left. It lingers in our DNA like a watermark. The cultural memory also remains embedded in language and art. Its expressions such as inoculate against ignorance or a viral idea trace their metaphors to this long coexistence with infection. Every time a writer describes a rumor or emotion as contagious, they are invoking smallpox ghost. However, unconsciously, the disease may be gone, but its vocabulary has become part of human thought. As the 20th century waned, philosophers and historians began to circle the story of smallpox like moths around a distant light. The eradication fascinated them, not only as a scientific triumph, but as a moral experiment, a test of what humanity could do when fear, reason, and necessity align. It was tempting to see it as a parable, proof that cooperation could conquer nature, or perhaps a warning that victory can tempt arrogance. The world no longer trembles at the sound of coughing behind a closed door, but it still glances occasionally toward those locked vaults, listening for the faint hum of the freezers. The scar has healed, yet the memory beneath it still glows, faint but permanent, reminding us that every smooth surface was once roughened by something we finally learned to outlast. For centuries, people had viewed disease as a moral mirror. Epidemics punished excess, revealed virtue, exposed divine displeasure. Smallpox fit easily into that framework. It spared no one, humbling emperors and beggars alike. But once eradicated, the virus could no longer serve as moral theater. There was no punishment, no divine lesson, just the quiet result of data, syringes, and persistence. The disappearance of smallpox marked a shift in the way humans understood suffering itself. It had been transformed from a spiritual problem into a logistical one. Writers noticed this change and tried to find meaning in it. Some described the eradication as the final chapter of the Enlightenment, a culmination of the faith in human reason. Others suggested it marked the beginning of something less flattering, the illusion of control. For millennia, people had learned humility from disease. Now they feared they might forget it. If humanity could erase smallpox, what else might it attempt to remove? Aging, death, imperfection itself. The debate deepened as biotechnology advanced. By the late 20th century, scientists could read and copy DNA with increasing precision. The entire genome of variola was sequenced and stored in databases. In a strange twist, the virus that once traveled in droplets and scabs now existed as data, an invisible string of letters preserved on hard drives around the world. Even if the physical samples were destroyed, the recipe for resurrection remained. The question of eradication had quietly evolved into a question of restraint. These were the sorts of questions that occupied quiet conference rooms in universities and think tanks, far removed from the fieldwork that had actually ended the epidemic. The field workers rarely joined such discussions. They were practical people who had spent years swatting mosquitoes, fixing Jeep tires, and coaxing villagers into vaccination lines. For them, philosophy was a luxury of those who had never smelled the inside of a quarantine tent. Still, they understood the unease. After smallpox, everything seemed possible, and possibility is a kind of burden. The thought unsettled ethicists. For the first time, humanity had the ability not only to cure disease, but to recreate it. The line between knowledge and temptation blurred. Some argued that true control required self-discipline, the refusal to do everything one could do. Others countered that ignorance is the greater danger. They pointed out that even if humans never rebuild smallpox, nature might do so accidentally through mutation or recombination. Understanding variola's secrets was therefore a form of protection. It is difficult to measure the emotional residue of something that no longer exists. The last natural case, Ali Maulian of Somalia, lived for decades after his recovery. He worked for public health programs, helping to vaccinate others against polio. When he died in 2013 from malaria, his obituary noted that he had been the final patient of a disease older than civilization. The virus had not killed him. Time had it. It was a quiet, symmetrical ending, the human outliving the inhuman. Meanwhile, governments invested in preparedness. Stockpiles of smallpox vaccine were maintained in secret quantities, stored in refrigerated vaults under military supervision. Public statements described them as precautions, not fears. Yet the implication was clear. Humanity had not completely trusted its own victory. Even in the age of satellites and gene editing, the shadow of smallpox remained part of strategic planning, filed under unlikely but catastrophic. For those who studied his case, Malin represented both closure and continuity. His survival symbolized resilience, yet his story remained incomplete because it lacked tragedy. For centuries, smallpox had been a narrative of suffering. Eradication replaced drama with calm despair with paperwork. It was a hard adjustment for a species accustomed to learning through crisis. In the decades that followed, the world found new ways to test itself. HIV arrived, then Ebola, then SARS. Each outbreak revived fragments of the old vocabulary: quarantine, contact tracing, vaccine development, but also exposed how easily lessons fade. Smallpox had taught cooperation. Subsequent epidemics revealed how fragile that cooperation remained. Nations hoarded supplies, argued over patents, and measured compassion in doses per capita. The memory of unity proved shorter than the memory of fear. Philosophers who wrote about these later crises often cited smallpox as a moral benchmark, a ghost against which all modern failures were compared. Why, they asked, could the world unite to destroy one disease but not another? The answer, they admitted reluctantly, lay in the virus itself. Smallpox had offered certain advantages to its exterminators. It infected only humans, displayed unmistakable symptoms, and lacked a hidden carrier. It could be cornered because it was visible. Newer diseases were more evasive, more ambiguous, more human in their cunning. Still, the myth of smallpox eradication persisted, polished by nostalgia. It represented a time when the world seemed simpler, when enemies were microscopic and solutions were tangible. The idea of total victory appealed to a species weary of compromise. People liked the story because it ended cleanly. Reality rarely does. Others disagreed, preferring simpler narratives. They argued that gratitude toward a virus was sentimentality, a confusion of cause and consequence. The goal of civilization, they said, is to reduce suffering, not to romanticize it. But even they spoke of smallpox with a kind of respect that bordered on awe. It was difficult not to. The virus had written itself across human history like a watermark, shaping art, policy, and even faith. Some thinkers proposed that smallpox should be remembered not as a conquest, but as a collaboration. The virus had shaped humanity's immune systems, technologies, and institutions. It had inspired medical revolutions, altered demographics, and redefined compassion. Without smallpox, there might have been no modern public health, no concept of global cooperation. In that sense, the disease was not merely an antagonist, but a harsh teacher. To erase it completely from the world, from labs, from thought, would be to forget one of the forces that made humanity what it is. In quiet museums and university archives, curators preserved artifacts from the Eradication campaign, vaccination kits, maps marked with red pins, the bifurcated needles that looked almost too humble for such significance. Visitors passed the displays with polite curiosity. Few lingered long. The threat was gone, and so was the urgency. Yet those objects still radiated a faint solemnity, as if they carried the gravity of everything they had once prevented. And somewhere in those sterile exhibits, beneath the glass and the silence, the philosopher's questions continued to hover. What does it mean to defeat nature? Can victory coexist with humility? And how long can a species remember the cost of its triumphs before it begins to forget again? These questions, unanswered, and perhaps unanswerable, formed the quiet continuation of smallpox's story. The virus was gone, but its absence had become a kind of presence, a space in which humanity could project its hopes, fears, and self-doubts. Like an empty throne, it reminded everyone that power and responsibility are never as separate as they seem. For all the philosophical weight assigned to smallpox, its eradication story is simple at the core. A small, unthinking thing met a species that learned finally to think collectively. It was not intelligence alone that ended it, but organization, the spreadsheets, the travel logs, the radio reports, the patience of people who worked too long for too little credit. The achievement was bureaucratic, almost tedious, and therefore deeply human. The virus itself remains motionless in its cages of steel and ice, a captive remnant of the empire it once ruled. Scientists who have seen it describe the experience as oddly anticlimactic. Under a microscope, Variola looks like an unremarkable brick-shaped particle, dull grey against the glow of the lens. There is no sense of the history it carries, the empires toppled, the children lost, the scars it left on half the species. Yet its genome holds a record written in code, the diary of millennia spent perfecting coexistence with humans until humans broke the pact. When historians write about the eradication now, they often use the language of triumph. But beneath that victory lies fatigue. By the time the last case was confirmed, the people who had chased the virus for years were simply tired of it. They were tired of outbreaks, of endless travel, of bureaucratic resistance, of filling out one more report under the smell of kerosene lamps. The end, when it came, felt less like conquest and more like relief, the closing of a long, exhausting chapter in the story of mortality. It is difficult to say whether that observation is true, but it fits the human tendency to assign meaning to victories after the fact. The practical truth is simpler. The world got tired of dying from the same thing and decided at last to stop the rest. The pride, the doubt, the ethical puzzles came later. Eradication did not end fear, but it redefined it. The thought that we could remove something so ancient raised unsettling possibilities. What else might be edited out of existence? And at what cost? Some philosophers mused that in eliminating smallpox, humanity had altered the balance between humility and control. The virus had been a constant reminder of vulnerability. Without it, perhaps we grew too sure of ourselves. Even now, the name smallpox carries an odd blend of horror and nostalgia. It belongs to the past, but still glows faintly in the mind, like a warning light that no one dares unplug. The scars have faded, the tombs have sealed, and the last victim lived and recovered more than 40 years ago. But history never deletes itself completely. It lingers, waiting for someone to open an old document and read the lines aloud again, softly, like a bedtime story that once kept the world awake. For in the end, smallpox was not merely a disease, it was a mirror. It showed humanity its frailty, its cruelty, its endurance, and its rare ability to work together for something larger than fear. The virus taught lessons no teacher could have planned, that progress often begins with panic, that compassion is contagious in its own way, and that even the smallest act of cooperation can ripple through centuries. The story's final truth is almost peaceful. The conqueror was invisible, but so was its defeat. No armies marched, no flags waved, no monuments rose. Instead, the victory lived in paperwork, syringes, and the small scars left on human arms. It was a triumph measured not in noise, but in the sudden global quiet that followed. And somewhere far below the hum of ordinary life, in those steel freezers humming through the endless cold, the last fragments of Variola remain asleep. They do not dream, but they wait, as all relics do, for someone to remember them again. Perhaps not out of fear, but out of curiosity, out of the strange tenderness we reserve for things that once terrified us and are now gone. The silence surrounding them is not absolute. It hums faintly, like breath behind glass, the sound of history refusing to fade completely. Every now and then, a generator hums, a red light flickers, and the air in the vaults stirs. The virus rests still, its presence reduced to symbol. It will never again topple kings or darken the faces of children. Its empire is memory now, an empire of stories, data, and the quiet gratitude of a world that finally, after 10,000 years, learned to sleep without its shadow.